And as a result of that, the Prime Minister is not at the moment submitting any returns, as he's supposed to do half yearly, on financial transactions involving ministers. There was also a system under David Cameron and Theresa May where every quarter meetings with donors were declared. As I understand it, that's not happening. And it's because there isn't this independent person at the centre to demand to see the proper accountability. I mean, there is a much bigger picture here. I mean, Transparency International, which is the sort of benchmarking body internationally, has Britain ranked about 12th in terms of honesty. I mean, we're ahead of many countries, but far below the Scandinavians, the New Zealanders or other. They have a much more honest system, much less exposed to corruption. We have these glaring problems at the moment, you know, the nominations of the House of Lords, which are, you know, the appalling scandal and are not being dealt with. So, yeah, we have major things to do to get Britain to be top of the class in terms of honesty in public life, which is where we should be.
Charles, well, why doesn't that worry you, that lack of transparency that Vince is talking about, that failure to sort of fill in the financial forms or the way appointments are being made? Why wouldn't that worry you?
I mean, lots of things worry me. My understanding is, though, that the issues that you're discussing tonight have been investigated. They were fully investigated. And there's a difference between an investigation not getting the result that you want as an observer and an investigation. Now, these investigations may not have yielded the results your other panellists wanted, but they were investigated. But I'm absolutely in favour of politicians and ministers and prime ministers and secretaries of state being held to account.
OK, but just go back to that point.
And the best way of doing that is on the floor of the House of Commons. So as soon as we return to Parliament in full, as opposed to having Zoom questions of ministers, I suspect that accountability will increase dramatically. The Prime Minister will face the Leader of the Opposition across the dispatch box in a full House of Commons.
Well, hopefully we'll see it there too. But I want to go back to the point that Vince Cable was making, which was particularly about Alex Allen, who, as you know, was an independent advisor who ruled that the Home Secretary, he said, had not consistently met the high standards required by the Ministerial Code of treating her civil servants with consideration and respect. He said the conclusion needs to be seen in context, and he said that there was no evidence that she was aware of the impact of her behaviour. But he found that she had not met the high standards. Essentially, he accused her, described as bullying in terms of the impact felt by individuals. Now, you know what happened as a result of that the Prime Minister overruled him because he decides that Priti Patel hadn't broken the ministerial code, and then it's Alex Allen that ends up resigning.
And the Prime Minister did overrule the findings. Priti Patel apologised, but that is why the Prime Minister needs to be held to account for that decision. And he should be held to account. He should be held to account by you in the media, on the floor of the House of Commons.
But the point that Liz is making is that he's not.
There is no rule that says the Prime Minister has to uphold a finding. He doesn't have to uphold a finding. But the fact of the matter is, in not upholding that finding, it is incumbent on the Prime Minister to account for his actions and the reason why he has not upheld it. And again, I think we're sort of trying to find an area of disagreement where it perhaps doesn't exist. The important thing is when Prime Ministers make decisions, they are held to account for those decisions and thoroughly scrutinised.
Well, if they can be scrutinised, which was the point that Liz David-Barrett was making. So two points.
I want to see them scrutinised.
OK.
I want to see them.
So Liz David-Barrett, is that scrutiny happening, A? And is the answer to it, as Charles suggested, that actually it happens on the floor of the Commons, or it happens fundamentally through the democratic system? Is that what we're saying now, that a big majority gets to do what it wants?
So I think it's not really happening. I think we've got a lot of institutions that are trying to regulate standards in public life, which are based on norms, trusting people to do the right thing and giving advice over what should be done. And increasingly, it seems advice is taken as, well, can be ignored. So I think we need to make those institutions a bit tougher. The independent advisor on ministerial interests, for example, would really need the power to initiate their own investigations, I think. And as for the democratic process, we know that in this country, many seats are safe seats. And so that democratic check on power from elections, it just doesn't work that well. It's also, only one check every 5 years. It's really not enough for this kind of more nuanced feedback on standards that we would need, I think.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for joining us this evening.
The weaknesses have been exposed that if you're an employee of a company that is lobbying government, as opposed to a self-declared lobbyist, you don't have to declare anything, so that the register is worthless in those circumstances. And the other is that the committee, which advises on business activities to stop the revolving door, it has this sort of blanket 2-year rule, which is fine, and that makes sense if you're talking about, say, a junior minister and a relatively minor business activity. But if you're talking about a senior member of the government, a member of the cabinet, let alone the prime minister, and a major corporate involvement, the same rules apply. And, arguably, we should be talking about much longer periods of exclusion, if necessary, lifetimes. I mean, there are sort of weaknesses in the structure which have been shown up and need to be dealt with. So
just in terms of the structure and the rules, I mean, when he lobbied the Chancellor on behalf of the government, did he break any rules there? I mean, was there anything that he crossed? There was no line that he crossed, actually, was there?
Exactly. I mean, as far as we can see, it behaved perfectly properly, and the rules were weak. The problem about the lobbying legislation is we knew they were weak, and they were deliberately diluted when the legislation went through Parliament, when it was discussed in government, and that is reprehensible. But that was, some years ago, and we didn't know that David Cameron himself would get involved in all this.
Let me turn to Liz David-Barrett, because the point that Alistair Campbell was making in Nick's piece was that all governments have scandals. We know that there are scandals or, moments for every government. But his point was that nobody seems to count them as scandals anymore. Liz, what is your reading of whether any rules are actually being broken here?
I think that we need to look at it perhaps not in terms of breaking rules, but in terms of declining standards. So you mentioned in the piece the Nolan principles that we have. Actually, these set really strong principles for how people in public life should behave. And I think we see that those are just not being upheld. To take a few areas, if you look at appointments to key public offices, they used to be absolutely on the basis of merit, and we see more and more political appointments now. People who are appointed on that basis just for loyalty are less likely to be good at the job, and they're less likely to ask questions. We also see, I think, an unwillingness to submit to external scrutiny, to put up a minister on major news programmes such as your own, or to publish transparent information about what the government's doing. And finally, I think there's a big problem with these internal investigations. So when there is evidence that something has gone wrong, or the allegations that it has, we really need to investigate, and that's absolutely critical for public confidence.
Charles Walker, can I turn to you on that? And we're very happy to have you as a representative of the Conservative Party as well, obviously, as a former chair of the House of Commons Procedure Committee. But the ultimate arbiter of the ministerial code is the Prime Minister. Are you happy with the way it is being arbitrated?
Well, I think David Cameron, I know David Cameron left office before he was 50, I think 5 years ago. It would be ridiculous to suggest that a former Prime Minister can't have a life after serving as Prime Minister, or a life before as serving as Prime Minister. And I'm not an apologist for serving Prime Ministers, but I do think in the case of David Cameron, he's left office and he is entitled to earn a living.
I don't think anyone was suggesting that he shouldn't have a life either before or after. But the points you heard Liz make just then was that this is now a government where appointments are made on loyalty, not merit, where there is a lack of willingness to have public scrutiny, and internal investigations are quite often thrown to one side. Now, as a Conservative, do you not worry that sort of Conservative values are just being sort of thrown down the stream?
Well, look, I'm really pleased we have a free media and a media that likes to interrogate politicians, prime ministers and ministers, and that's your role. The fact of the matter is we're discussing this tonight. It's been discussed in newspapers. It's been discussed on multiple news outlets. And as I think David Cameron used to say, sunshine is the best disinfectant. So I'm greatly reassured that when things are uncovered, that people think there might be a problem with those things, they get aired, discussed and debated. And that's the role of a free and open press where people are held to account.
So, Liz, it just comes back to the role of the press, I guess, that as long as we're asking the questions, then it doesn't really matter if the internal rules or the principles, the Nolan principles, aren't being upheld?
I don't think that really holds, actually, because what you really need for accountability is not just that you expose things, but that if there is a problem, it's investigated and then some kind of action is taken. And that's what sends the message that it's not OK to behave in that way. So I think a free press is really important, but you also need people who are listening, who are then going to take action.